Okay, so joining us now to discuss the whole situation, including its professors suing the Trump administration, is Mike Leon, NTD News contributor and the host of the Can We Please Talk podcast. Also joining us is Timothy Allen Simon, attorney and emeritus law professor, Board of Trustees, USF. So, Timothy, I'll start with you this morning. The administration is citing Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Can you speak to the legal basis for using it to justify this funding freeze?
Well, I think it's being used in a weaponized fashion, but be that as it may, the Supreme Court has spoken in the Harvard University of North Carolina case, basically stating that race cannot be used as a factor in admissions. And, following on from the University of Michigan special admissions case, it is basically sunset, as Sandra Day O'Connor stated. But with that being said, the larger threat is, of course, academic freedom, which every university typically prides itself with. And to this regard, because of the $52 billion endowment that Harvard has, they're able to take the lead in challenging the administration on what many perceive as a threat to academic freedom.
So, Mike, do you think it's reasonable for the federal government to attach certain conditions for universities in order to receive taxpayer funding?
Hey, Don, good to see you first and foremost. No, I don't. And I kind of agree with everything that Timothy said about the academic freedom part of this. And again, crying poverty for Harvard when they do have a $52 to $54 billion endowment is something that's very funny in and of itself. But something that Caroline Levitt said there, Don, yesterday about this is, look, Trump ran on this. I think a lot of people did not listen to Trump in the fall and what people were trying to talk about with respect to Donald Trump's different, campaign stops, et cetera, and some of the speeches that he made. He ran on some of this, like in terms of the way higher education is teaching people. So to see some of this stuff actually come to play out is not something that I'm actually shocked about. I think it is wrong. I think obviously the professor suits that happened yesterday with respect to freedom of speech is something that will be challenged in the court. And I know Timothy could speak a little bit more about this, but I just think right now the administration, and Caroline Levitt said this yesterday, Don, from the press briefing, all Harvard has to do is apologize. Those were her words, not mine. So it just kind of shows the pettiness that's happening with respect to this case. And I don't think the administration, look, you want to tackle anti-Semitism, you want to tackle hate speech that's happening on college campuses, all for that. Let's talk about all the groups that are affected by hate speech and how that plays out. But I think it's being very petty with respect to how it's administering this. And they're targeting Harvard because they know Harvard is obviously the cream of the crop with the Ivy League. And we know what happened with Columbia actually compromising with the administration, and their funds are still in a holding pattern right now, Don.
Okay, Timothy, as we know, Harvard professors are now suing the Trump administration. Can you speak to their legal arguments here that Harvard professors are making in this lawsuit, and particularly regarding First Amendment rights and academic freedom?
Yeah, well, first off, academic freedom and speech, freedom of association, these are all basically the foundational characteristics of our United States federal Constitution. And the suits are largely alleging that the administration is using the fight against anti-Semitism as more or less a smokescreen on what is a greater concern, and that is the content of information that's being taught on campuses, be it critical race theory or other areas that in the culture wars that we have in this country have been deemed illegal or inappropriate, but no court has said such because of its respect for speech and academia. So I think the professors are taking on the Trump administration. How this court will rule will be interesting, but we have seen a break in the ranks, particularly with Amy Coney Barrett and Chief Justice Roberts. So I think that even if this issue goes to the Supreme Court, unlike the issue of special admissions, or what we used to call affirmative action, I do think even this court will recognize that the ability of the executive branch to control the teaching, the content of what professors teach on college campuses is a slippery slope. And I would expect that they would side with the professors if it goes that far.
All right, Mike. So given what you said earlier, do you agree with how the university has handled the campus protests?
So that's a good question, Don, right? Obviously, Claudine Gay obviously stepped down. And look, this happened on my college campus. You see the R pin, that's for Rutgers University. It's not for Republicans. Some people think that. But there were college campus protests that happened there. And our university president, Jonathan Holloway, recently resigned. And a lot of people felt he wasn't handling that in a respectable manner, at least to the Jewish community. And then obviously the Palestinian community and the protests there. So I do think that, look, there's something at play here with respect to how campus police and work with state enforcement with respect to whether it's a public university or a private university. That's a conversation for the legal beagles like Timothy of the world and for law enforcement officials to all be unified with respect to what's allowable on a campus protest. They just had some protests down where I live in Miami at FIU because of the 18 students who had their student visas revoked recently down here. So this is something I spoke about with a class down there at the university recently. Like, I agree. And I agree with, let's say, a little bit of the administration's position about the campus protests last year kind of set off a bunch of, or opened up a can of worms, let's be honest about that. That's completely different than what is happening with respect to attaching federal funding that goes to research programs that help save lives. That's what a lot of this would be impacted with what Harvard is doing. And to use that carrot to dangle before the horse is something that I think is wrong. And I think it's going to be proven out in court. And kind of what Timothy said, I think the lawsuit, if taken up by the Supreme Court, the court will say you can't have an effect on speech like that with respect to dangling this carrot before the horse. So again, Don, separate conversation. The administration is not pointing to that. They're using the guise of that with respect to how they're telling Harvard, they should structure their content, to Timothy's point.
Okay, Timothy, your thoughts on what Mike said as well. Same question to you. Do you think Harvard has done enough to ensure the campuses are safe and inclusive for Jewish students?
That is, I think, arguable, to be very honest. We had a Palestinian encampment at the University of San Francisco, or a pro-Palestinian encampment, should say. And the president of the university actually revoked the status of some of the students. But I think the concern of the American people should be, what is anti-Semitism and what is a resistance to the Benjamin Netanyahu government and the war in Gaza, which has cost the lives of approximately 45 to 50,000 Palestinians. And of course, the tragic 1,200 Israeli citizens who died at the hands of Hamas. There's a bigger picture here. I lived through the Vietnam campus protest. I lived through the removal of apartheid in South Africa campus protest. And I know that this speech is sacred. However, I'll quote Van Jones, who said that campuses should be places where people feel intellectually challenged or unsafe, but physically safe. And it is important that the public safety officers and local law enforcement of these campuses do everything they can to prevent violence, whether on people or property. And that's where I would agree with the administration.
Okay, 30 seconds, Mike, real quick.
Yeah, I mean, Timothy said it as best. Look, again, we want to separate the two things. And I think the administration right now, from a public messaging standpoint, I always use the communications lane here, Don. I don't think that they've done enough of that. And to Timothy's point, this is going to all play out in court. But it's truly, if you truly want to talk about how these campuses police and how they actually allow freedom of speech, whether it be protest against an administration or against, the Israel's response in Gaza to what happened on the horrific day of October 7th, that's in a completely different argument than what the Trump administration is doing with respect to cutting funding that will impact critical research programs that the university already does. So those are two separate things. I think the administration is not doing a great job from a messaging standpoint in terms of identifying the first one. Let's all get unified on the first one. The second one shouldn't be in play.
All right, that's it for today. Thank you both, Timothy, Mike.
Don, Mike, thank you.